Thank you very much. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this conversation. It's very nice to meet you, having heard your praises sung.
Thank you.
You sociology and anthropology, was it, that you did?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to say, and that was 2014 when you left, so do you want to say a bit about what you've been doing subsequently?
Yeah, sure. So I now work full-time freelance as a journalist. So I cover social affairs stories, mostly on kind of inequalities and a bit of politics, but sort of I guess small p politics and how it affects people's lives, rather than the ins and outs of Westminster.
Yeah.
But before that, just immediately after graduating, I also worked in sort of campaigns roles on inequalities in the third sector, and in a college as well. So I kind of did a bit of that like real world work, if you like, before I went into writing about it in a journalism sense. But now I'm doing the journalism full time, and I'm working on a book at the moment about trade unions. So that's kind of taking up all my time at the moment, and I'm doing slightly less, slightly fewer articles and things.
Yeah. And you talk a lot about trade unions, I'm sure, as a consequence. You have that look about you of somebody focused on writing. So when we had an email exchange about having this conversation, you said everything you do is informed by a sociological perspective. Can you say a little more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I suppose as I just said, I consider kind of all my work to be through a lens of equality, or more often inequality.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really informed by kind of what I studied at Edinburgh, and by a sort of sociological understanding, just thinking about how you get beyond what things look like on the surface to the sort of structural reasons for things, is really important to me. I always try to sometimes I can feel myself being a bit of a broken record as I'm writing something, where I'm writing, there's a structural reason for this. So it's designed like that. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to sort of pin down, because I do just feel like it's just a way of looking at the world and looking at the issues that I write about. And, it's especially kind of relevant at the moment with all of this business, because I think that probably the sociological angle is sort of the least understood, or the least sort of talked about in the mainstream. You see the science being talked about, and you see the economy and business being talked about, and then you see people starting to get towards the sort of human social element of it, but not always quite getting there.
Yes,
So
I've read comments that said social scientists should keep quiet because they're not. It's not important. What's important is medicine and epidemiology, and nobody else has a right to speak. That's clearly not something that you would agree with.
No, and I mean, I think we've got a huge, kind of social crisis happening alongside the scientific one, but also kind of in the post further down the line, when the science gets towards a vaccine, and maybe the pandemic, I think the idea is that it won't ever fully die out, but when it's kind of under a bit more control and our lives sort of go back slightly to normal, there are going to be really long-lasting effects, in terms of sort of psychologically and sociologically. And we need to be talking about them now.
Well, I think also structurally, but I mean, reading some of your journalism, one of the things that I was very struck by is that people in sociology talk about bridging the gap between social structure and what happens at ground level, but in your journalism you do that to a large extent. I mean, I was very struck on the piece that you wrote about women as carers, and how that interfaces with ideas about work and employment and who's valued. So it brings together those different levels. Is that something you do kind of naturally, or is it something that you sort of consciously put into practice in your journalism?
I think it's quite obvious to me, really. That's just the way that I see the world, I think. And I think that has to do with having kind of done that journey of like studying these things in an academic sense, and then sort of putting them into practice in a, campaigns like frontline sense, and then writing about them. I'm kind of able to bring those different bits of what I've done together, which is really helpful. I think not everyone has been kind of lucky enough to have those experiences in all those different ways. So yeah, some of that stuff just seems so kind of obvious to me that I almost find it difficult to explain to people. But we definitely need to keep on explaining it. This is kind of proven not everyone is on the same page.
I'm very struck by some of the differences between what you do and some of the health correspondents that I read, who seem to have no point of contact with anything to do with health other than the talking heads that they treat as experts. So they take everything on trust. They don't actually have a kind of ground level activist or any other kind of involvement that informs their journalism. It's almost in a vacuum.
Yeah, I think some of the strongest journalism that we've seen during the pandemic has actually been collaborations between different types of journalists, because I think you do kind of need, I wouldn't have any of that scientific sort of public health knowledge really, but someone who was a specialist in those areas wouldn't really have the same access that I have to, low paid carers, for instance.
Yes, they don't have medical expertise either.
Yeah.
What I mean, like they're a conduit for the people that they're interviewing, rather than having a set of benchmarks that enables them to evaluate and contextualize that. And that's what I think is really interesting about you and other journalists of a similar persuasion, who seem much more sort of rooted in what journalism used to be, which was investigation.
Yeah, and I'm just not, I think there's real value in sort of science journalism and things like that, but it's just not my interest. I'm not interested in doing journalism because it's journalism. I'm interested in doing it as a way to sort of make a difference and give people a voice and, hopefully change things maybe. That's the reason, not just to write.
Well, so can we turn to one of these big topics then that your kind of sort of rooted investigation style journalism is concerned with, which is the state. I mean, it's become old-fashioned to talk about the state, but it's become something that's sort of watching what's happening. You think there are these deep ironies. I mean, there's not only the tricky relationship between England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and what on earth is going on or not going on. But also we have this bizarre spectacle of a Conservative government, almost removing homelessness and poverty.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that those things need not exist. With a political will, they need not exist. So there's something very something quite dramatic going on about the state. I mean, do you agree with that? And do you think it will last if you do?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that it's been, I think dramatic's a really good word for it. I think when I remember watching the press conference when the Chancellor announced all the kind of furlough scheme, and he explicitly thanked the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, and I was just like, if it didn't already feel like we were in a sort of parallel universe, like that was that was it.
But for me, a similar moment was when they opened all the hotels and all the homelessness. Take a room, please take a room.
I know.
Like, oh my God.
Yeah, and as you say, it does show, and I think that we have to see it as like a huge opportunity and also a huge threat if we're being realistic, because I think there's every chance that we now see really difficult sort of economic decisions about austerity and things imposed for decades with the justification of coronavirus. So I think we need to watch out for that. But I think there's a huge opportunity, because we now it's not possible now for politicians to turn around and say, well, poverty is inevitable, homelessness can't be ended, workers can't be bailed out, because all of those things have essentially happened now. So I think that's a huge opportunity. It's going to depend, I think, on how citizens kind of respond and organise themselves, and I would say it because I'm writing a book about trade unions, but things like union structures and how much they're able to sort of organise effectively, I think are going to have a huge impact. But it's all up for grabs, definitely.
Do you think that one of the things that might be up for grabs is so-called migrant labour? I mean, we have the heroes, the carers, the NHS turn out to be these people that some politicians have wanted to banish from our shores.
Yeah.
So I think many more people now have an appreciation that migrant labour is actually to ordinary folk who've been here for 10, 15, 20 years, who have a commitment. And whose role is being revalued as high value rather than their poorly paid and low value. Do you think that's one of the things that unions might take up much more strongly than they have up until now?
Yeah, I mean, I really hope so. As I say, I think I think we have to see all these things as opportunities, because it would just be so depressing not to. So I think there is a huge opportunity there for unions and for sort of, politicians and political actors in general to make that case. I suppose in some ways I am slightly pessimistic about that, because, we saw just this week the immigration bill going through Parliament, which is very much about valuing people for their sort of skill level and creating this idea that jobs like care and things that we've seen being really valuable during this crisis, creating an idea that they're like low skilled and unimportant, and that we don't kind of want those kinds of migrants coming here. So the fact that that's still going through, and the fact that we saw, politicians from the Labour Party who, in a very oversimplistic way, you might expect to be the champions of immigration. We saw like Yvette Cooper, for that bill and justified it in terms of having to have cross-party unity during a crisis. So we're actually seeing coronavirus used to justify like some of these kind of moves against migration of different forms. So we need to watch that, I think, because if this hasn't proven how important those people are, then I'm not quite sure what could.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there needs to be things that happen at a very grassroots level around elections and election campaigns, and not let the politicians put these things in brackets or conveniently forget them because it suits political expediency. Another thing, which as we're talking about things we can be pessimistic about rather than optimistic, how we started out, is the use of surveillance technologies to track and trace people with coronavirus symptoms, and whether there may be long-term reverberations of this. I mean, I've been very interested in the debates that have gone on between Google and Apple on the one hand, the government on the other, different styles of software that might be used. What's your view on that?
I mean, I think it's very worrying. I'm not a tech expert, but certainly when I've been kind of looking into the sort of plans and the criticisms of them, I think they are worrying. And when you think of even things like CCTV, which is now quite a standard part of our kind of lives and the surveillance of the state, but even when you look at the kind of arguments around that being introduced, that was all about how it would target the most vulnerable. And so I think that's the kind of lens that I try to look at anything like this through. Is maybe it's fine for me to be surveilled all the time. I don't particularly like the thought of it, but I'm not especially at risk of being, deported or anything like that. So it might be fine for me, but what's it like for these people who are kind of much more on the margins or vulnerable in different ways? And I think there are a lot of worries there that something like this could be used as a veil to rush through technology and surveillance that hasn't been kind of fully tested or thought through.
Have an incompetent government, because the likelihood of it being used efficiently is actually not that great.
Yeah.
More likely that the information will be used by Google and Apple and sell it on. A large part of it is actually selling on data rather than using the data themselves. So it will be, drawn into much more commercial uses, or selling on to surveillance companies that then do contract work for governments. So I think,
Yeah.
so we've gone from very optimistic to quite pessimistic. Let's go back to the optimistic aspects of this, and consider. I mean, you're a sociology graduate. You use your sociology in practical ways. You've kept in touch with some sociologists. Do you have ideas about in what ways you think sociology and the other social sciences ought to be responding to what's happening? I don't just mean like this week, but sort of longer term. I mean, is investigating outbreaks and all of the kind of very substantive things that people seem to be doing, is that sufficient, or is it much more this thing about perspective and how we're viewing what's going on and the changes that are stemming from it?
Yeah, I mean, you'd sort of outlined this question before we spoke, and when I was trying to think through it, it just seems ginormous to me, because I think the one thing that this has done is sort of shone a light into the corners of every single social relation that exists. So, there are kind of so many different ways we could go with it. I think for me and my interests, the things that I'm obviously kind of really invested in are ideas about sort of solidarity and care and things like that, and how solidarity can be sort of used to reshape these social relations in a really positive way coming out of this, and how kind of concepts like care have not sort of changed at their core, but how our understanding of them changed through this crisis. But I mean, another thing, and this is sort of slightly outside of what I would normally write about, but I've been sort of thinking, trying to think over in the last week, is that there's something about the way that the UK, or as you've kind of implied, actually kind of England, because I think this has really shown up the devolved nations. But something that's come up is the way that there's a sort of British exceptionalism or ideas about sort of British nationhood that have actually had a direct impact on like how devastating coronavirus has been for the country, because all this sort of war language that we've used about, like, or I say we, that the government have used about fighting the kind of battle of the virus, and even in really literal ways. So when you saw the footage of VE Day parties, for instance, where it seemed like social distancing just didn't apply to those parties, there's something about the way that we, or I think possibly England, understands itself as a nation that I think has had real impacts on like how devastating coronavirus has been. And I'd really like to see sort of more analysis of that. I'm still trying to sort of think it through in my own head, but it's kind of interesting to me that relationship between, nationhood and something that seems very scientific and biological, but actually there's something going on there.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that it's the old industrial towns and cities that are getting it in the neck. Where I live, Barrow is not that far away. It's now the epicenter, but Glasgow before it.
Yeah.
Middlesbrough, Newcastle. It's these old industrial cities, which have a lot more in common than they have differences between them. They have a historical and social structural past and present, which is actually very similar, and they're epicenters of inequalities and injustices.
Yeah.
So I don't see quite the difference between the English government and the Scottish government, and I find, to my horror, I agree with Arlene Phillips on at least one thing, which I never expected to do.
Yeah, it has been strange.
and Wales. So I think in terms of some of your interests, they transcend these national contexts, and it's something about the state and its relationship with class, with the social structure of employment, employment trajectories, housing stock, all of these very material things which, as we've seen recently, we've ignored, or the politicians have ignored at our peril.
Yeah, absolutely. And the narratives that are being drawn around those things, I think we need to kind of be vigilant of. We talked about the sort of idea of migrant labour and things like that, but there's been very concerted efforts to whitewash that. And when you look at some front page newspaper front pages, for instance, the pictures of NHS frontline workers are like of all white people, which is just not representative of the NHS. And so I think there's a lot of things going on in terms of class and race and gender and all of these kind of lenses of different types of inequalities. Some of it is very kind of purposeful. So I think we need to kind of watch for that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and maybe that's the point on which we should finish. And thank you very much for a very interesting conversation, which I hope will continue.
Yeah, thank you for asking me.
That's a pleasure. It's been really interesting. I'll just turn this off.